Welcome back, you guys. Welcome back to the channel. Last night I landed here from Australia. It's the first morning back and I've got to go through all of these animals, all the creepy crawlers, all the reptiles, get them cleaned out, set up, ready for a feed tomorrow. 3 weeks away. Is it possible to leave your animals for 3 weeks with no extra food or water? Can it be done? Is it safe? Is it the right thing to do? Why would you? I'll roll the intro and I'll tell you.
My hand swelled up and it was very painful overnight.
So I've actually had this video in the bag for some time now. I've ummed and ahed because it does require the application of some common sense, which you'd think would be pretty okay and normal. But of course, we know that we live in a world where common sense is becoming rarer and rarer and rarer. So let's just be clear. If you're going away and you have reptiles and invertebrates, the ideal option is to have someone looking after them full time who is at least as knowledgeable as yourself, so things are looked after correctly, records are kept, and of course they don't let those snakes escape. And that's a really big thing with people that don't really know snakes. It's so easy to let them escape and not shut those enclosures properly. Your number two best option is if you've got a local reptile centre and you've just got one or two or a tiny amount of reptiles. Many of them offer a really good boarding service where you can take those reptiles in and have them looked after by them. Bear that in mind. For the rest of this video, apply common sense, for goodness sakes. It's there to help. It's warts and all. That's the whole point of this channel, is to help people understand these animals better. And for legal reasons, of course, this is all a fable made up for YouTube. Enjoy it. I've decided to let it run and see what the response actually is. So for someone like me, going away on holiday, absolute nightmare. Absolute nightmare. A, financial cost, I can't afford it. B, what do you do with all your animals if you've got one pet snake or 150 pet snakes, let alone all the mammals and birds that are part of our businesses? What do you do? How do you go away if you've got all these animals? Well, when it comes to the birds and the mammals up at Icarus Falconry, that's not a problem because we've got a great team of people that don't need me there to look after and exercise those birds and animals. So tick, no problem there. It's everything in here. It's everything in here in the reptile room. What do you do if you've got one snake and you're going to go away just for 1 week, let alone 3? Who can you trust to feed that snake, water it, clean up its poo? Do you know what? Number one, and not let it escape. What about fire or electrical things going wrong or bulbs blowing? What can you do? Well, I'm going to show you now. I'm going to turn you around, show you the state that these animals are in, which actually is fine. But warts and all, nothing's been prepped. I'll show you what I've come back to, and I'll talk you through some of the ways you can mitigate problems. And if you haven't got someone that you trust to look after your snakes, I'm going to disregard the laws where you or I live. I'm going to disregard the social media input, and I'm going to tell you how I've got around keeping my animals really well and safe for 3 weeks without risking someone that doesn't know enough tampering with or even just opening these enclosures to give care to these animals. I'll tell you how we got around it. So number one, water. You don't really want your animals to go without water. These reptiles, of course, can go without water much longer than mammals and birds, a ginormous amount longer. How do you make sure there's enough water to last? 3 weeks in my case, but a week is very different, a lot less problematic. Not only does the water not got to evaporate and stay relatively clean, the worst thing is, especially colubrid snakes, they like to poo in their water. So number one, those snakes' last feed needs to be at least a week before you go away. So my snakes haven't eaten for 4 weeks now. Most colubrids will defecate or poo within a week, because if you don't, the first day you leave, they could poo in their water. So essentially, they haven't got any clean water to drink while you're away. Make sure they're well fed. Clean the animals out right at the last day before you go, but put in 2 big water bowls. Essentially, add a second water bowl to the enclosures that's top to the brim. That way, if they should poo or soil the water that's there, even if you're sure it'll last long enough without evaporating or them drinking it all, they've got another one. Mitigate it. It's worked really, really well here. 1 or 2 things have pretty much just run out of water, but even those animals like the reticulated python that's got a huge water bowl, or even the mangrove snake here, almost all gone, but there's still relatively clean water in there with no soiling at all. So water is your number one priority. That water has to stay, and it has to stay clean for the whole time you're away. Priority number one. Next up, keeping those animals at the correct heat. Now, if you're going away in autumn, the things that I've managed to get around is I brumate most of my North American and European colubrid snakes and other reptiles through the winter. So they started a bit earlier in October, towards the end of October this year, but they were all sorted and settled for brumation before I left. That's a huge amount of my collection. Don't have to worry with. Brumating on thermostats so they don't freeze if the weather does get cold. Fresh water that they might sip out during brumation. So straight away, if you're going away at the right time of year, brumating those animals from North America and Europe almost gets rid of all your problems. But for the rest of those guys, what if there's a power failure on your house? Well, really, that's a problem, and for me that's fine. I had a house sitter, so at least if the power went out, it would be tripped back on at the fuse board. What if individual heaters blow, the balls blow, heat lamps blow? You've got to mitigate that, because there's no one here to notice them if no specialist care is available. So for me, make sure everything is on a thermostat and everything is clipped up well. There's guards, the wire's all done. Things that you've kept thinking, oh, I really need to sort that out. If it's electrical, make sure it's sorted before you go. But what happens if a bulb does blow and that lovely thermostatically controlled environment that doesn't need your input now starts to get cold? Well, then you've got to think about minimum temperatures for those specific animals. And there's one good way you can achieve results, certainly in a reptile room like this. Remember, if it's from North America, that animal, or Europe, and you go away and it doesn't have any heating because the heating fails, the bulb blows, to be honest, that animal's going to be just fine. You haven't fed it for a week before you left. It hasn't got food in its system. It's got fresh water. It'll just go into brumation. But for those tropical species, let me show you, my fail-safe. So again, I'm not apologising for any mess. No one's been in here for 3 weeks. This is as it is. There's no BS on this channel. We employ the top husbandry, or rather the best husbandry for our systems and our setups we can. But I'm happy to show you the warts and all. This is my get out of jail free card. It's set so it can't overheat. It's not set on a high setting. It's set so it can't overheat. But this setting corroborates with, sorry guys, thermostats up there that actually control its temperature. This is a fail-safe. Should the better quality thermostat stick on, this guy here won't go too much above temperature before it's rather rubbish, but inbuilt thermostat kicks in. A space heater for the room. This is set to 22 degrees. I think I got it down to 18 or 20 degrees before I went away. 20 degrees. Make sure if you can, you get one with a, look at that under there, a trip switch, for any reason it gets knocked over, it will not work. It will not face the ground and set fire to your house. Use some kind of secondary heating on a thermostat in the room to give a background heat. So for that way, even things like reticulated pythons here, like these guys, or the black-headed pythons down here, will survive and they'll be fine. If you keep these guys at those temperatures for long, they won't eat, and of course they'll end up with respiratory tract infections. Have a background heat source maybe, so if your heat lamp blows, as they do, and the Murphy's Law, they'll blow as soon as you leave, they're not going to freeze. It was down to 2 degrees here in Northamptonshire while we were away. I couldn't have this room freezing. Have a background heat source of some kind on a proper thermostat, which will save your animals from getting too cold, if too cold is going to cause some problems. While we're on the subject of heating, I cooled a lot of these animals down. So some of the colubrids, like the crebos, I actually set their temperatures lower anyway. Lower temperatures, as long as they're within their remit, mean that animal's metabolism is going to slow down. It's going to have less requirements to eat and less requirements for its whole metabolic process, hence water consumption and so on. So to a degree, check out your animal's given parameters for that species, and it's probably worth lowering those settings down a little bit on the thermostat, which will keep them less active and less problematic for them, for their bodies, to go without that food and so on and so forth. So temperature, you don't want to get too low, but you can actually use lowering of the temperatures to give those animals a break while you're away from them, make life easier and their needs less while you're away. Next up, cleanliness. You don't want to come back to animals lying in poo, scale rot and so on. So as aforementioned, for colubrid snakes and things like that, feed them their last feed at least a week before you go. That doesn't work with pythons and boas. They might do a monthly turnout. So that week or 2 weeks before, they might still do a huge poo. If you've got a good quality substrate, that's not a problem at all. It will soak up the liquid from their excrement and it's not going to cause scale rot. If you're keeping your pythons, big pythons, on a paper substrate, the huge amount of liquid that's released at the same time will run through the paper. The same for active colubrids like false water cobras that have a high metabolic rate. If they're laying on wet newspaper, there's going to be a massive chance of scale rot. So even some of my bull snakes, my youngsters from this year, I've actually put coir husk in there instead of the paper they're normally kept on. So for while I'm away, they've got an absorbent nappy, if you like, so they don't get nappy rash, if that makes sense. I can still see there's some annoying flies in here. Now, we've mentioned the fact that your snakes don't need any food. Same with your spiders and a lot of your inverts, but you do need pre-feeding. So you want to make sure everything's got a good body weight on it. You want everything well fed, not just a few days before, probably a month before. Increase the food of your animals, your snakes and your spiders. Make sure they're really well fed, and then they can have more than enough body mass on them to see them through for that fasting period. This is no cruelty, it's not a problem. This is all natural behaviour. Nearly all the snakes you find in the wild have feasting seasons and very lean times. As long as you make sure they've got good body mass on them and you can make sure they've got a water source while you're away, that's fine. But up their food a few weeks before, give them double feeds or just a bit extra food. Just make sure they're in good body shape to go without food in the leaner times coming up. If you can get a house sitter, that's great. If you can't, but you can have someone pop in on a daily basis or just regularly, just get them to pop in and check on things. Make sure these people have the knowledge of where your stop tap is, where your electricity fuse board is, so they can turn these things off in an instant. Better to be safe than sorry. No one wants to be bothered on their holiday. My instructions were to everyone, if there's a disaster or even something I love as much as my golden eagle Zeus, if he dies, I don't want to know. What good can I do the other side of the world? I don't want to know. But of course, you do need people in there that could deal with such things should they happen to a degree. If one of your animals dies, it needs to be taken out, doesn't it? Put in a freezer, buried, disposed of, whatever. Or you're going to have one smelly room to come back to. The very worst things that could happen it would be handy if there's someone checking in just to make sure. And the worst thing that could happen if you keep reptiles is a fire. That's for another video. But let me show you the one thing I didn't do. So when I was running up to leaving, I just went through my list of the little jobs that I haven't got round to doing and made sure everything was done. Every enclosure was ship shape, all the heating, all the thermostats, everything was in good order. And there was one thing on my list, but I hadn't wrote it down. It was in here. Fatal for me. I worried about it for the first week, and then I had to put it out of my head. And the worst thing did happen. Well, the second worst thing. Let me show you. And this could have been a massive disaster. Reptile keeping, fires are your biggest worry, I think. So just there should be this heating lamp, ceramic holder, and of course a guard to stop this guy burning himself. By the way, look, there's some poo there, being a python, but a good substrate keeps it to a dry spot. Anyway, this wasn't there. This was laying down where he is right now, shining across and laying on the dry fibrous coir substrate. I think if that was newspaper, the whole place would have burnt down. The only good side was his thermostat, and hence heating, is on a timer for 12 hours off at night, because these guys need to be cold through autumn to trigger their sort of their late autumn breeding. So they need the nights to be cold. Maybe that was a saving grace. The wire runs through here, and here, up at the corner here, is a little bit of wire as it goes out the vivarium. Now and again, I noticed he'd crawl over the wire and drag the excess slack in. Now and again, I thought it must be on my thing to do list to clip it up tightly all the way along. And when I was away that first week, I didn't do that job. And I had to console myself to think, in years, it's just now and again that he does that, pulls that wire down a bit. The worst thing nearly happened, but the second worst thing was he'd obviously gone down on it, pulled on it, his body weight, until he'd run out of slack, and the whole weight of him had pulled this off the ceiling. And a hot infrared heat lamp laying there pointing at coir made me feel sick last night when I came in and checked these animals. Always make sure your electrical equipment is secure and safe. Double, triple check, because even this guy, for some reason, having been chilled day and night, even if he'd have got an RSI, a respiratory tract infection, he'd have been okay. If the whole reptile room had burnt down, he wouldn't have been okay. And my wife would also have been a little bit cross because it's in our house. Okay. Predatory invertebrates like your spiders and your scorpions, don't worry about them at all. Food wise, not a problem, even worth considering, even for weeks. Water wise, make sure their water containers are filled, but they'll be okay. More importantly, the ones that need humidity, you never quite know when they might next molt. Make sure not only are the water bowls full when you leave, but more importantly than that, I think, the substrate is very well soaked. I'd rather have it almost wet as long as they're ventilated, because a week, 3 weeks, it's evaporating slowly but surely away. If they shed their skin and they're bone dry, these guys from humid environments are going to suffer much more than any amount of food loss. They can survive months without food. They can't shed their skin if they're too dry. But otherwise, your arachnids, no problem at all. Your cockroaches, plenty of dry feed, they should be fine. Invertebrate wise, I think your biggest problem will be leaf eaters such as stick insects. A week, 2 weeks you'll be fine with a big enclosure and food in a water container with its roots in a jar, if you like, its stems in a jar. But when it comes to running out of food and dying, things like stick insects would be your biggest problem if going away for a long time. But spiders, scorpions, scavengers like your millipedes and your woodlice, make sure the humidity is up or the moisture content of their environment is correct, if not rather a bit higher, to sustain them. Not a problem at all. But what about your lizards? Well, for the crested geckos, jelly pot supplements, a food dish full of food, mealworm dish with some food for the mealworms, and lots of crickets. Moist substrate, large water bowl, no problem at all for the 3-week period. Tropical fish, no problem. Feed well on the run up, no problem at all. If you've got plants, put your lighting on a timer switch, no problem whatsoever for most fish going a month without food, as long as they're well fed on the run up. And the good thing is for things like these fish, if the light's on a timer, the algae will keep growing and they will graze on algae. So Jemima, my old bearded dragon, she's done just fine. Water bowls ran dry, not a problem. Mealworms, well fed on the run up, and a large bowl of mealworms with plenty of dry meal for the mealworms to eat. A lot of them have died and desiccated, but there's still some live ones in there. Well fed before, and a long lasting food source just to tide her over. But now, I think, time for a clean out and some fresh grub, along with everybody else. Okay, so I've got a busy couple of hours ahead. That'll get this room, 3 hours, completely bottomed out. Tomorrow's going to be all about catching up with paperwork, and then Wednesday, because it's Monday today, get up and see the girls at the Falconry Centre, and yeah, give them lots of thanks for the good job they've done of looking after all those animals that I didn't need to worry about whatsoever. This is how you can get over a problem if you do forward planning and use a lot of common sense. This isn't anything to do with morals, ethics or laws. The best way, of course, is having backup with your animals, someone that you feel totally confident has the knowledge and the expertise to look after your exotic pets. Don't let keeping animals stop you from seeing the world and seeing other animals in nature. Even your dog. Do things from the minute you get a dog to mitigate. Can other people look after them? Are they comfortable to go elsewhere? Can they be kennelled without stress and anxiety hitting the ceiling and going through the roof? Think about it. You decide on your morals. You find out about the laws, or whether you're willing to bend the laws even. That's up to you. That's up to you. I'm just telling you that for 3 weeks, I've come back to perfectly healthy livestock. Thank goodness for that.